Hey everyone, Dogen here. Happy New Year. Hope that you had a good holiday break, and here's to a much better year this year than what we had last year. In this video, I'm releasing the next episode of Japanese Phonetics to the public because another one of my patrons contacted me directly and said, if I pay you a lump sum of money to offset the potential loss that you would incur from releasing another lesson to the public, would you mind releasing a lesson to the public? And I agreed to that, just like I did in the past. About a year ago, there was another situation where we did the same thing. So this is the next episode of Japanese Phonetics, episode 5, where I talk about various important terms when discussing pitch accent in Japanese. This is the original episode 5, however, and I made this episode, I want to say about 4 years ago at this point. So the information in the lesson is still very valuable, I believe, but there's a couple of things that I would like to add to various segments of the lesson. So I'll just give some additional information with this shot as the video goes on, just such that it's more useful for everyone watching. So thanks again to the patron that made this possible, and I hope that you guys enjoy this. Talk to you soon. Bye. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 5th episode of Japanese Phonetics by Dogen. In this episode, I would like to discuss Japanese pitch accent terminology. Today we will be addressing the following terms: pitch, stress, accent, downstep, Mora, intonation. Now, when it comes to Japanese pitch accent terminology, different resources define things differently, so expect there to be some discrepancies between the information presented here and the information presented in other pitch accent resources. What I've tried to do is present all terminology, all relevant terminology, in easy to understand language. Pitch: the high and low tones of a word or phrase. From a strictly technical standpoint, Japanese has only 2 tones, low and high. For example, in the word taberu, as in eat, the ta is a low tone, the be is a high tone, and the ru is a low tone. Besides particles, which include wa, ga, ni, de, o, demo, made, all standalone words in Japanese have pitch accent patterns which include both low and high tones. Let's look at a few more examples of pitch. Miru, kiku, hashiru, gakusei. It's important to note that high pitch is not the same thing as high volume. So in a word like kiku, when we go from low to high, you can imagine a piano. You're going from a low note to a high note, but hitting each note with approximately the same amount of force. Therefore, kiku is correct. Kiku is not. Pitch: the high and low tones of a word or phrase, independent of volume. Okay, so pitch, this is the first thing I'd like to briefly touch on a little bit more. And the main reason for this is because I could have used a better example word when exhibiting the difference in low to high pitch change, because the word kiku, it's a heibang word, and all words that belong to that family have a low to high pitch change, at least in careful pronunciation. However, if you know anything about phonetics, and I talk about this later in my series around episode 33 or so, I believe, there's this phenomenon known as devoicing in Japanese, and that's when the vowels i and u come between certain sounds. You essentially don't say them. So you don't say ki with the e articulated, you say ki, kiku, kiku. So there's actually not a really noticeable, even audible change in pitch, because the first sound of kiku doesn't really hold a pitch. So a better word to exhibit this example would probably be nose. So nose also belongs to the heibang pitch accent family, low to high. And nose in Japanese is low, ha, and then high, na, ha, na. And I'll put a native recording here so that you can hear this carefully.
Hanaga, hanaga.
Hear it properly, rather. But again, the point that I wanted to make with this when talking about pitch, and I addressed this towards the end of the segment, is that a difference in
low to high pitch is different from a change in volume. So if you say hana and you go from low to high pitch, it's okay if there's a slight change in volume, but it's not like in English where you're really stressing the accented part of the word. And hana doesn't really have an accent because it belongs to the hebang family anyway. But again, it's about a difference in pitch and not a change in force. So earlier I said kiku is correct and kiku with too much force is wrong. But again, it's hard to tell the difference because the E is devoiced. But again, if we use a word like hana, then hana, that's okay. But hana with too much force, that's not so good. Native English speakers typically don't have too much trouble doing that in two Mora words like hana. But if you took another word like taberu, to eat, oftentimes native English speakers, they would maybe say the be with too much force and also too much length, because one of the characteristics of English is that when you're stressing a particular syllable, you add force and length to it, and as a result of adding force, typically the pitch will go up as well. But the important thing is just to not, if a word has an accent or if a word goes from a low to high pitch, you're increasing the pitch alone and not the volume of the word. So that's the first thing I'd like to add to that first little section.
Number 2, stress. The amount of force that is applied to a syllable, word, or phrase. English is a stress accent language, meaning that certain syllables receive more force than others. So if we have a word like university, the ver receives more force than the surrounding parts. University, university. So when we hit the ver on our mental keyboard, so to speak, we hit the ver with more force than the other notes. Consequently, the volume for ver increases as well. University, university. Speaking again from a strictly technical standpoint, stress is not an official element of the pitch accent system in Japanese. This is why, as previously mentioned, kiku is correct and kiku is wrong. I've read some Japanese phonetic publications that describe this phenomenon in a very easy to understand way. English and German words have strong and weak bits, where Japanese words have high and low bits. I believe this to be a very simple way to describe the difference between a stress accent and pitch accent language. That being said, intonation does influence stress in Japanese, and I will be touching on this at the end of the video. Stress, the amount of force that is applied to a syllable, word, or phrase. Number 3, accent. This term has both sociolinguistic and phonetic definitions. In the sociolinguistic sense, it refers to the general spoken characteristics of a language and is used in the following way. John's Russian accent is almost native. In phonetics, accent refers to some kind of distinct emphasis put onto part of a word in spoken language. Now, I say some kind of emphasis because this emphasis can come in the form of either stress or pitch, as previously explained. English and German speakers use stress to indicate accent, while Japanese speakers use pitch to indicate accent, or lack thereof. So stress and pitch are tools to convey accent or the absence of accent. This is where the terms stress accent and pitch accent come from. In Japanese, speakers use differences in pitch to articulate the distinct accents in words and phrases. Thus, Japanese is a pitch accent language. Number 4, downstep. Speaking very generally, there are 3 types of pitch accent patterns in Japanese. Low to high, as in kiku, high to low, as in miru, and low, as in hashiru, or kokugo jiten. High to low and low words exhibit downsteps, meaning that somewhere in the word there is a pitch change that goes from high to low. In miru, this occurs between the mi and the ru. In hashiru, this occurs between the shi and the ru. And in kokugo jiten, this occurs between the ji and the te. This downstep or high to low change in pitch is classified as the accent or prominence in Japanese because the change in high to low versus low to high is usually larger. So miru, hashiru, kokugo jiten all have accents. But what about kiku? Does this word have an accent? Well, does it have a downstep? Kiku. No, it does not. This means that kiku, which is in the heiban or low to high family, does not have an accent. The important thing to take away here is that the downstep is the accent or phonetic prominence in Japanese, and that although all standalone words exhibit some kind of change in pitch, not all words have an accent.
So again, here I used kiku, which isn't the best example for a heibang word because ki doesn't hold a pitch because of devoicing in that word. But the takeaway point for the last section of this previous segment is that there are many words in Japanese, the pitch accent family known as the heibang family, that don't have accents. That's something that's a little bit hard for native English speakers to wrap their head around at first, but just be aware of that in your Japanese studies. Not all words have accents.
5. Mora. A thorough understanding of this term usually doesn't improve Japanese pitch accent or pronunciation, so I'm going to keep things very simple. A mora is like a syllable but counted slightly differently. In Japanese, all full-sized hiragana or katakana characters count as one mora or one beat. Dōgen, my moniker, has 4 hiragana. Dōgen. Thus, there are 4 mora in the word, although if we use syllables to count, we can see that it only has 2. Dogen. When a small hiragana or katakana character such as ya, yu, yo attaches to a larger one, the combination counts as a single mora. So if we have a word like kaisha, this counts as 3 mora. Ka-i-sha, kaisha, and a small tsu counts as 1 mora. Thus, the word gakko has 4 mora. Ga, ko, u. Use mora, not syllables, to count the beats in Japanese. It's necessary to do this when looking up the pitch accent patterns for words. Number 6, intonation. Up until this point, I have used the words intonation and pitch accent almost interchangeably, as many people who aren't aware or familiar with the term pitch accent use the term intonation to describe the standard pitch accent changes that exist in Japanese. It is necessary, however, that we differentiate between these terms going forward. Pitch accent, as in pitch accent pattern, will refer to the textbook pitch accent changes for individual words or phrases. Intonation, on the other hand, will refer to how a pitch accent pattern for a word or phrase changes based on a speaker's emotions or motives. Towards the beginning of this lesson, I said that from a technical standpoint, Japanese has only 2 tones, low and high, and that stress is not an official element of the Japanese pitch accent system. This is true. However, when intonation or a speaker's emotions or motives are taken into account, words in Japanese can exhibit not only changes in pitch, but stress as well. This is why when a computer speaks Japanese, there are only 2 tones, low and high, but when a human speaks Japanese, there is a vast tonal spectrum. This is a fairly controversial topic in Japanese phonetics, so I'd like to read a small bit from P.M. Susski's publication now. It seems the use of stress on important words in speech is universal in any language, and the Japanese is no exception to the rule. When one pronounces a syllable more forcibly than others, the pitch of voice is raised slightly. This is of natural consequence, as when more force is used in utterance, more air tends to escape. The vocal cords are involuntarily narrowed in their unconscious efforts to prevent too rapid escape of air. The result is the raising of pitch accompanied by more force and loudness. The Phonetics of Japanese Language with reference to Japanese script, Routledge Library Editions, Japan. Susski, P.M. What Susski is saying is that when emotion is taken into account, stress does exist in Japanese, and that it often raises the pitch, force, and loudness of words. But if stress does exist in Japanese, and that stress can change the pitch, loudness, and force of a word, then isn't it pointless to study Japanese pitch accent? No, and this is because stress in Japanese works within the framework of pitch accent. This is why it's so important to study Japanese pitch accent. When you make a mistake in an utterance that doesn't have very much stress, it's not a very big deal. But the more confident you are in your Japanese, the more likely you are to add stress to words and phrases. When you say things with stress, but in the wrong pitch accent pattern, it makes the mistake that much more apparent. So oftentimes when people don't study pitch accent, the more confident they are in their Japanese, the worse it actually sounds. Again, this is one of the reasons that Japanese native teachers will tell their students that Japanese is a flat language. We must study pitch accent such that we can properly understand where stress can and cannot be placed.
Okay, and this is the last bit that I really wanted to give some additional information about. I said that stress in Japanese typically behaves within the framework of pitch accent. And here's what I mean by this. When I was studying abroad at Keio University, and before I started taking, I guess it was at the beginning of my pitch accent classes, I was pretty confident with my Japanese because I had been studying Japanese pronunciation in detail fairly intensively up until that point, but not pitch accent. So I didn't really know that pitch accent was a thing. I knew like a little bit about it. I knew that it existed, but I hadn't studied it. And so I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and my friend asked me, said something to me, and the thing that I said to him in response was, I said, school, as a question. And so the proper way to say that in Japanese would be gakko, with basically a more or less flat pattern that has an inflection at the end of it. Gakko. That word in itself, gakko, is another word from the Heibang family that doesn't have an accent. Rather than saying gakko, I said gakko because that's what my native English speaker mind had unconscious or come to believe was the correct pronunciation. And the reason for this is because there are many words in Japanese that are similar to gakko in structure, but have different, but belong to a different pitch accent family. So, aisatsu, for example, that's a four-mora word that has two kanji, so it's similar to gakko in that sense, but aisatsu has the accent on the first mora. So if I said aisatsu, greetings, as a question, it would be aisatsu. So it would start high, go low, and then there would be the question inflection at the end. However, I was under the impression, because I could hear the atamadaka pattern that exists in aisatsu, I assumed that unconsciously that basically all Japanese words that had four mora belonged to that family, and that all words had accents, and that the proper way to say gakko was gakko, or the proper way to say student was gakusei, or the proper way to say bank was ginko. Because again, as native English speakers, we have the tendency to assume that all words have accents when many, many words do not have accents. So again, a second ago when I said that the more confident that you are in your Japanese, but if you don't know anything about pitch accent, your Japanese actually tends to sound significantly worse because you're confidently adding stress to places in words where it shouldn't be. So again, if I say gakusei desu with the accent on that first mora, or if I say gakko, and I can vividly remember that conversation. In that instance, I was like really under the impression that my Japanese was like really, really good because I was studying Japanese pronunciation, which was something that most of my classmates weren't doing. So when I said gakko, with like that specific mannerism that I had seen in like Japanese TV and like kind of the lip placement and stuff like that, I thought, okay, everyone around me that just heard that knew that my pronunciation was perfect and they were probably really impressed by it. But what happened is, on the spot, my friend said, Dōgen, gakko じゃなくて gakko desu. So generally speaking, I could say school and not add too much stress, not really try and really emphasize the fact that I was surprised, and just say gakko, and that would be okay. Or I could really try and add stress and emphasize the fact that I was surprised and say gakko, and generally speaking that would be okay too. But the minute you switch from that pitch accent pattern, working within the confines of that pitch accent pattern, to a completely different pitch accent pattern, and say, again, something like gakko, that's when things can start to sound a little bit off to native speakers, especially if you're adding a lot of stress. And it's not as if all words always play by the books, just like similar to how in English, a native English speaker doesn't carefully stress the accent for every word that they say in a sentence. It really kind of depends on the sentence level. But again, if you're saying a single word in isolation, like if I said tomorrow, it would sound off if I said tomorrow. It's sort of like that. That's a pretty obvious mistake to most native English speakers. But again, that doesn't mean that every single time a native English speaker says tomorrow, that they're always saying it with that exact same amount of force on the accent and that it's always the same. It's just that there are kind of general rules that if you know them, it'll make your spoken language sound a little bit more natural. And finally, I'd like to emphasize this. I talk about this in, I think, lesson 2 or 3, which are also public lessons, but it's okay if you make, it's not like the world is going to end if your pitch accent is off. Oftentimes people will understand what you're trying to say anyway, even if you do have pitch accent errors, pitch accent mistakes in your Japanese. But for the people that are interested in improving their Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent as much as possible, studying pitch accent is probably a really good idea. And that's where I was. I wanted to sound as native as possible, which is why I studied pitch accent in detail. So again, that last bit kind of turned into a sales pitch, but I wanted to kind of give the counter argument here. You can be very intelligible and get your point across in Japanese most of the time, even if your pitch accent is off. But there's a difference in being able to get your point across and trying to improve your pronunciation and spoken language as much as possible. So it really all depends on your own personal goals. I think that's probably enough additional information to this lesson. I'll end things here and let the remaining 20 seconds or so of the lesson play out. See you guys soon. Bye.
Okay guys, that's all for this episode. There was a fair amount of intermediate and advanced Japanese phonetic knowledge presented in this episode, so I would encourage everyone to view it multiple times. In the next episode, I will begin to introduce and break down the individual pitch accent patterns in Japanese, and in episode 7, I will introduce the various free third-party tools you can use to supplement your phonetic studies. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment here on Patreon. Thank you very much for your continued support, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.